he's not talking? Huh? Okay. All right, so committee, we are going to go ahead and get started here. We're going to start off with bill introductions. Does anybody on the committee have any bill introductions that they would like to do? All right, seeing none. Representative Croft, I believe you have a bill introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a bill introduction. It's RS 1030. It's an act to make county sheriff positions.
We're going to continue to push on while IT tries to fix it.
Okay.
Continue.
Elected position. Yes, ma'am. It's RS 1038.
And real quick, could you just explain to us what it is again?
An act to make county sheriff positions an elected position.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Representative.
Sure.
What? I think a majority of them are, but I don't think it's in state law.
Just as a comment, Riley County is the only county in Kansas that has a combined county and city. It's called RCPD.
Correct, and I don't think his bill would apply to that. And he's shaking his head no. So we'll have to get the language of his bill here at some point. But yeah, I don't think it applies to Riley County.
It has a specific language in KSA to account either for a county that wants it or for Riley County that has it.
Okay. Thank you, sir. All right, we're going to go ahead and pause until we can get the other room online. All right, since we have all the committee in here now, seems to be a pretty normal trend. We might just have to drop the whole second room thing going forward. All right, so committee, for the first order of business, we are going to have a hearing on House Bill 2118. And I would like to go ahead and call on the revisor to give us an overview of House Bill 2118. Mike, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. 2118 is a bill that was introduced a year ago as well by the Ethics Commission, and it actually passed out of the House committee and died on the House turnaround. So it got to the floor on general orders, but that's as far as it went. What the bill does is it amends a statute dealing with political advertisements, and it deletes the requirement that the treasurer's name be part of these advertisements. And it also, on page 2, provides that when you're making a website, email, or other type of internet communication that you're paid for or sponsored by has to be clear and obvious in the message somewhere. So that is the bill.
All right, real quick, Mike. For the new members of the committee, have we passed the striking of the treasurer's name previously into statute, but then there was a mishap to where it didn't go into statute?
I believe that's correct. There was some confusion about a conference committee bill a few years back, and that's I believe this was intended to fix that confusion of about 2 years ago.
All right, thank you, Mike. Are there any other questions for the reviser? Representative Miller.
Yeah, I've been wondering for 2 years what the mishap was. I never did hear what the problem was. This got all the way to the governor's desk, didn't it?
It did, and I think there was a disagreement among conference committee members about how it was supposed to be worded.
Did it get signed?
It sure did.
So what difference does it make if somebody had disagreement once we signed it into law? That's where I'm lost. And it's more for the old members than the new members, because 2 years ago, it was me that put it in the bill. And so I was, quite frankly, surprised that summer to learn they weren't adhering to what we passed. So I'm deeply curious who it was that made up the law after we enacted it.
The conference committee report didn't apparently reflect what the conference committee agreed to, and it was missed by those people that signed the conference committee report, if I remember correctly.
Oh, now I think you're pointing the finger at me. Never mind.
I don't know whose finger to point at. You could argue that it was a reviser's error, but whoever is responsible, it didn't get done apparently the way people thought it should have been done. There was a little bit of confusion after the fact among conference committee members in terms of whether it was a error.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any further questions? Representative Dodson.
Just real quickly, I'd be interested in knowing why this was a requirement before. That kind of tells me why we should take it out.
I think that might be a question better left for the proponent. Are there any further questions for the reviser? Seeing none. Thank you, Mike. All right, we are going to go ahead and open up the proponent section of House Bill 2118, and the chair recognizes Mark Skoglund, Executive Director, Governmental Ethics Commission.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, to give me an opportunity to be here to discuss HB 2119 or 2118. We've talked about this a little bit when we discussed the annual report, and you have my testimony there in front of you. There are two portions of the bill. The portion that discusses the removal of the treasurer is actually not from an Ethics Commission recommendation, but the Ethics Commission doesn't oppose the change. It's just not a recommendation. So we're neutral with respect to that portion, but we don't have any issues with it. With respect to the slight change to paid for attribution or sponsored by attribution for electronic communication, this is really an attempt to make the law a little easier to comply with, and also in the course of doing that makes it possible to comply with on certain pages. Right now, there are a number of forms of electronic communication where it is impossible or practically extremely difficult to put a sponsored by attribution at the end of the item, simply because, for example, on Facebook, there is no end. The page scrolls back forever until you reach the very beginning. So practically complying with that statute with respect to Facebook is sometimes very difficult. This would make it easier for people to comply. They just have to put it in a clear and obvious location and in a way that could be legible. This is something that, this is the FEC language, or very similar to the FEC language. So there's good jurisprudence behind it that we can cite to as well. So there's, we view this as simply a cleanup provision to update the statute to more modern forms of communication, and also ensure that this future-proofs it a little bit for possible future communication methodologies that could arise as well. I'm certainly able to take any questions, but otherwise I think I'll leave that portion of my presentation here pretty brief on this item.
Are there any questions for the Executive Director Committee? I am seeing none. Is Representative Parker online, by the way?
Here, Mr. Chair, but I don't have any questions.
All right, I just switched the view on the TV in the committee, so, yep, seeing that now. Thank you. All right, so seeing that there are no questions, thank you, Executive Director, appreciate it. I have no other proponents listed. Does anybody else wish to be a proponent? Seeing none, hearing none, I'm going to go ahead and close the proponents section of House Bill 2118. Are there any opponents or neutrals for House Bill 2118? Seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and close both of those sections, and we are going to go ahead and close the hearing on House Bill 2118. We are now going to move to House Bill 2163. Revisor Heim for an overview.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is another bill that was recommended by the Secretary of State's office. And what it does is it repeals some statutes that are arguably obsolete, not arguably are. One statute, 25-222, provides it shall be the duty of the Secretary to prepare all forms necessary to carry out the provisions of basically the election law. And the Attorney General's asked to give assistance and so on. I think there's a number of places in the election statutes that require forms and so on, and it's superfluous. 25, 1709 and 1710 are some obsolete restrictions on certain corporation donations to candidates that no longer would be basically considered unconstitutional. And the statutes in KSA 254501 seek our presidential preference primary, which no longer exists. If you've got questions, basically it's a cleanup bill.
Are there any questions for the revisor regarding this bill? Representative Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike, I hope this is an easy one. I had a question from a constituent about the presidential primary piece. Can you, I hope this isn't putting you on the spot, can you reference, when did we have a state-run presidential primary? Did we used to do it regularly? Was it just one time? And when did we do away with that?
If I remember correctly, I think there was only one that was ever done, but the Secretary of State's office can probably address that better than me.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions for the revisor? Seeing none. Thank you, Revisor Heim. All right, so we're going to go ahead and open up the proponents section of House Bill 2163. For the proponents, I have Clay Barker, Assistant General Counsel to the Kansas Secretary of State. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. And I'm joined here in the same room with Mr. Caskey and Ms. Copal. The Secretary of State had us in 2019 go through the election code to statute by statute, looking for small changes that could be made to clean up the election code and get rid of confusion. And we've identified a number where a minor process change could save county chairs or county election officers a lot of work, inconsistent statutes, obsolete, things like that. And we've decided to start with the low-hanging fruit on that with this bill, which eliminates some what we believe are just obsolete statutes that every year I get phone calls on in the last two election cycles. People are just a little confused about what they are. And I'll go through each one. And last year, these same deletions or repeals of obsolete statutes got through the Senate. I believe the vote was 36-3, and then it ended because of COVID. So the first statute is 25-222. This is the last remnant of the original 1908 primary law bill, which was passed in a special session that brought primary elections to Kansas. And the act it refers to is actually the 1908 law, which no longer exists. The statute is sitting there all by itself. And as the revisor pointed out, there are lots of other statutes that give the secretary authority to create forms, and we always have the ability to go to the attorney general to ask for advice. So this is just obsolete and probably should be repealed just to avoid confusion. The second group are the 25-1709, and 25-1710. These are the last remaining statutes from the original Campaign Finance Bill of 1911. And what they essentially did is they listed a series of businesses that were highly regulated by government, railroads, telecommunications, and forbid these companies and their trustees and major shareholders from being able to contribute to Kansas campaigns. And in the 1980s, the Attorney General issued a series of opinions that said, well, this is unconstitutional. These statutes were watered down until they reached their current form, which essentially lists a group of companies and instructs them to follow the campaign finance laws, which they already have to do. So these statutes are again, obsolete. And 1709 lists the companies, and 1710 provides a punishment that is actually much smaller than what our current law would allow the Ethics Commission to do. And the Ethics Commission feels that these statutes are outside their jurisdiction. They aren't part of the current Campaign Finance Act. Every year we get phone calls about whether banks or railroads have some special duty they're not aware of. And eliminating these obsolete statutes would, again, just clarify for voters that there is no confusion here. The last piece has to do with the presidential preference primary. Just a brief history, it was passed in 1978. It's been done twice in Kansas history, once in the 1980 election, and there were some unforeseen complications that convinced the legislature that this is probably not a good idea. And in that case, it was, you remember that far back, some of you, Ronald Reagan won Kansas, but a guy named John Anderson got a lot of delegates, and he flipped and became an independent, and people realized that the inherent problem with the presidential preference primary is that unlike the state's primary where you were actually electing the party's candidate, all a presidential preference primary does is allows voters to express which candidate they think should be the party's candidate. Those numbers are then given to the political party, which inserts them into a party-designed formula to determine how to allocate delegates to the national convention. And the party can do winner-take-all, proportional, pretty much anything it wants, and all at the taxpayer's cost. So the state then every 4 years would amend this statute and say, we're not going to do a presidential preference primary until 1992, when, if legend is true, Bob Dole asked the legislature to allow a presidential preference primary so Pat Buchanan would not beat Bush in the Kansas vote. We have not done one since 1992, so it's been about 30 years. And I think it's, and then in 2015, the state realized that instead of every 4 years having to amend this statute, they simply eliminated 4501, which was the statute that said thou shalt hold a presidential preference primary, and replaced it with 4501A, which said the parties will pick their delegates any way they want, and it's at their cost. And what this last part of the bill does is it eliminates the mechanical provisions of the presidential preference primary, the ones that say this is how you will do it, how you will report, how you will canvass. Those provisions have no purpose being there because there's no need to do a presidential preference primary anymore. But again, it confuses voters. I got a lot of phone calls this year, whether the secretary canceled the primary. People swore that they had voted in the primary 4 years ago. When I tell them, well, there wasn't one, I'm not sure how they did. And I think eliminating this will eliminate a lot of voter confusion, since it's the legislator's will that we no longer even have the ability to hold one of these presidential preference primaries. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll stand for any questions.
All right, Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going back to the campaign finance part of your presentation. You mentioned a list of companies. Was that companies specified by name or just generally industries? Certain industries?
Representative, there's a list of industries that at the time were regulated by the highly regulated. It lists, for instance, banks, insurance companies, railroads, telegraph, telephone, natural gas, electric companies, heating, power, water companies, things of that nature.
All right,
and so those companies, those companies and their owners, trustees, were forbidden from making any campaign contributions.
All right, thank you.
All right, are there further questions for the Secretary of State's office? So Clay, just real quick, this is basically just another cleanup bill. What is the difference between this bill and the one we just passed out a few days ago?
The one you passed out a few days ago was similar, but it dealt only with the census. This bill just deals with some generic election laws. In the 2020 session, the Senate Elections Committee, then Elections Committee merged the two into one. We obviously have no objection if that's what this committee would like to do, but they are somewhat distinct issues, but they do both center around deleting statutes.
All right, thank you. Committee, are there further questions for the Secretary of State? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Barker. I'm now going to close the proponents section. I have no other proponents listed. Are there any opponents or neutrals to HB 2163? Seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and close the opponents and neutral section of House Bill 2163. And we are now, so committee, I think in my personal opinion, these two bills are pretty non-controversial. Do we want to suspend the 24-hour rule and work them today? Representative Miller.
Well, I was going to ask you that question, but since you posed the question, I think you answered mine, and I would move that we suspend the rules and we consider action on both those items.
Second from Representative Neighbor. All right, committee, we are going to go ahead and start working. Oh, actually, hold on. We haven't needed to vote first. All right, so all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye or raising your hand online. Aye. Okay, no? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion carries. So we are going to go ahead and work House Bill 2118 first. And for discussion on House Bill 2118, what is the will of the committee? Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move that the committee pass out House Bill 2118 favorable for passage.
Okay, looking for a second. Second from Representative Berquist. And since, I'll just make sure, is there any discussion? Representative Proctor.
I've got a question for the reviser, Mr. Chairman, if I could.
Yes, you may.
So when I look at the bill, the way that the treasurer has been stricken, it looks like, I'm getting some feedback there, Mr. Heim. Could you mute your mic for a second? So the way the statute looks like it's written to me, the way you've stricken treasurer, it used to say chairperson or treasurer. So the way I read it, it looks like we all now have to put, you know, paid for by, and then a chairperson for our campaign committee. Is that a misreading of what you've done there?
That's correct. You have to put the chairperson. You used to have the alternative.
Okay, so.
Hold on, I don't think that's right.
I think it may be the right answer, but it was never what we intended. So we may be back to having some confusion between legislative intent and revisers drafting. The purpose, if I may, Mr. Chairman, you and I were both part of that discussion. And back to Representative Dodson's question originally, is the question arose as to why we ever required that, and all we could garner is just because. And my point was, it doesn't really tell ordinary people anything who the treasurer of your campaign is. What they want to know is if you're paying for the ad, they want to know you did it. Or whatever outfit is paying for it, they want to know who they are. And putting the treasurer on there, or even the chairperson, doesn't really give any additional information to the reading public about who's paying for it. So the answer to the question is we couldn't come up with a reason why it was ever required. And the other point was, and I'll give my example, I don't want my poor treasurer's name exposed to my material just because he was kind enough to agree to do my books. He's not responsible for the content of what I put out. And I think it makes it hard for us to find a volunteer treasurer to do that work. they're not running for office, and I don't think their name should be necessarily exposed. So that was the discussion. And back to Representative Proctor's question, I didn't remember what we intended that way, that we meant to put chairperson in lieu of treasurer. It was to apply to either one, that the real party of interest is the candidate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would just echo what the comments were from the ranking minority member. Basically, and I think we might have to have an amendment here, but basically, yes, what we are looking for is just where it says paid for by Pat Proctor for state representative. Nothing after that. No chairperson, no treasurer, because at the time when we passed it, none of us saw a benefit in that. And so, yes, Representative Parker, I see you're on the list. So real quick, I'm going to go back to Representative Proctor because we kind of stole the ball from you. So go ahead, sir.
I would be very interested to hear what the rest of the committee has to say about this, but first I'd say the way I read the statute, and I hope that either the Mr. Skoglund or Mr. Heim will correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but the way I read the statute, if I don't have a campaign committee, which I don't have to establish, then I don't have to put anything after the paid for, but a party or an organization would still have to put the chairperson on there. But then the next thing I would say is I can think of a lot of times when it might be important to voters who the treasurer is, because it says something about who's supporting the campaign. Like, for instance, my treasurer is the spouse of another representative here in from an adjacent district. And I've had, in our city commission, people who were supported by the treasurer was the spouse of a sitting representative. And I was intensely interested in that fact, and so were a lot of other voters. So as it stands now, I would not support this bill for that reason.
Representative, striking this does not prohibit you from adding the treasurer onto your pay for by. So you could still add them if you wanted to, but it's not a requirement.
Right. I understand, Mr. Chairman. The comment I'm making is that it doesn't require somebody, and if somebody wanted to conceal that information, there would be nothing to compel them to do it. And I think it is in the public interest to know who the treasurer is for a campaign, because sometimes it's a really interesting fact. That's my opinion. I understand that some on the committee might disagree.
All right, Representative Berquist.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. You can go on, anyone can go on the website of the Secretary of State and Ethics and find out who the treasurer is for the candidacy. So that's not an issue, and we're not required to have a chairman. So I think it's a mute issue. I agree with Representative on that issue. Thank you.
Representative Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I echo Representative Bergquist's comments about it. It is still publicly available if folks want to find out. But jumping back, you and I have been through this bill or versions of it, multiple hearings. If I remember correctly, I think Representative Proctor may have been getting at this. The reason it was written this way is so that an organization that doesn't have an individual attached to it would still have to list a chairperson, whereas Brett Parker for Kansas, it's advocating for my own election. People know who to hold accountable for whatever is on my mail or my paid communications. But since someone can go out and create a political action committee with basically any name that they want, if I'm remembering right, the intent of leaving chairperson on there before was that in that instance, there would still be an actual human being's name attached to the paid communications. Guess what I'd like to clarify with Revisor Heim or Director Skoglund is that, am I reading that right? And as it's currently written, would it accomplish that? So to Representative Proctor's point, my campaign has a treasurer. I wouldn't need to list that, but a political action committee would still be required to list their chairperson.
Director Skoglund, would you like to answer?
Sure, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity. This is actually resolved in reg that under KAR 1924A2, candidates never have to list a chairperson because candidacies typically don't have a chairperson. And the regulation specifies that. So chairperson disclosure only applies to parties and PACs, which does have some sort of transparency benefit. That was at least the discussion that was had the last time that this was brought up. So chairperson in the statute doesn't require a candidate to list a chairperson because the regulation specifies that candidates never have to disclose chairperson. They will just say paid for by person for office, and that would be sufficient.
All right, Representative Dodson. Oh, I thought you had your hand up earlier. My apologies. There's somebody before you. Representative Miller. Representative Lehon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my question is, I guess for you, Mike, at the federal level, is that a requirement then for them to say paid for by, and then whatever they're, or is it just paid for by campaign such and such? Do they
I'm
do
gonna let
it?
Mark answer that question. I don't know what the federal requirement is without looking it up. I'm sorry.
I believe the executive director might, though.
Sure. So disclosures of a treasurer is something that doesn't happen in a lot of areas. It's not required federally. Treasurer disclosure is something that the last time we discussed this, we looked around at a few states to see if anyone else had required it. There may be some states we didn't do a comprehensive analysis, but it certainly would be the minority if anyone else requires it. So treasurer is something that is a rare item, certainly to be required in a paid for attribution.
Thank you, Executive Director. Okay, committee, is there any further debate on House Bill 2118? Seeing none, would anybody like to renew their motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that when the committee pass out House Bill 2118, favorable for passage. And I close.
Okay, do I have a second real quick? Okay, well, we're just gonna make sure. All right. All right, all in favor of passing House Bill 2118 out of committee, signify by saying aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. House Bill 2118 is passed. We are going to move to 2163 next. And do I have a motion for House Bill 2163? Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee pass out House Bill 2163 favorably.
I have a motion. Do I have a second? Second from Representative Collins. Discussion. Seeing no discussion, Representative, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I close.
All right, you've heard the motion. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. All right, are there any announcements for the good of the committee? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you guys very much.